September 18, 2024, 11:42 a.m. Jefferson Street, Denver. A teenage girl was pushed from her wheelchair in front of her entire school. 30 students watched. Phones recorded. No one moved. She hit the pavement hard enough to scrape skin, but not hard enough to silence the laughter. And then something unexpected stepped between her and the crowd, a German shepherd, still, focused, unafraid. But that wasn't the moment that changed everything. Minutes later, a black SUV pulled up, and inside it was someone who had been waiting years for this exact kind of call. What those boys didn't know, what the crowd didn't know, was that traffic cameras had captured every second. And what Emma didn't know was that a promise her father made in a federal courtroom years earlier was about to come back to protect her. This wasn't just a bullying case. It became a civil rights investigation, a courtroom confession, a mother's public apology, 300 hours of community service, a frozen watch stuck at 11:42, a speech that broke a room into silence, and 1 year later, an entire school standing up on the exact street where she once fell. So here's the real question: what hurts more, the shove or the silence that follows it? Stay with me, because by the end of this story, you won't just be thinking about what happened to her. You'll be thinking about what you would have done. Before we start, make sure to hit like, share, and subscribe. And really, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. At exactly 11:42 a.m. in full daylight, Emma Carter learned that silence can hurt more than cruelty. The autumn sun hung high over Jefferson Street that September morning, leaving nowhere to hide. Outside Lincoln Ridge High School, students moved in clusters across the wide front steps, voices overlapping, bags swinging, ordinary moments unfolding. Emma guided herself carefully along the pavement's edge, steady and composed, wearing confidence like armor. She never looked for trouble. It never mattered. The shove came without warning. 1 second upright, the next the sidewalk rushed toward her. Her palms hit the asphalt, skin tearing, breath knocked from her lungs. For a heartbeat there was only the thud of impact and the rasp of pavement. Then laughter, sharp, careless, phones lifted, screens recording. The sun exposed everything. On the cold ground, her mind escaped to Cedar Grove Park, oak trees, dirt trails, movement without apology. That world felt distant now. She tried to breathe as laughter continued. Then a German shepherd moved through the crowd, calm and deliberate, placing itself between her and the boys. The noise dimmed, phones lowered, dozens watched, no one helped. That chosen silence settled over Jefferson Street like a second fall. Stay with us? This story will leave you speechless. Emma was still sitting on the pavement when the black SUV turned onto Jefferson Street, moving with unhurried confidence through the thinning crowd of students. It pulled to the curb and the driver's door swung open before the engine had fully stopped. The woman who stepped out moved with the composed efficiency of someone who had spent years walking into situations others preferred to avoid. Her dark coat carried the quiet authority of a federal badge, and that badge caught the autumn light as she introduced herself. Agent Rebecca Hayes, Federal Civil Rights Division. She had received the alert through a traffic camera flagline 30 minutes earlier. She had not hesitated. Officers had already begun reviewing footage from 2 intersection cameras positioned along Jefferson Street, both of which had captured the full sequence of events with the unblinking clarity that only automated systems can provide. Hayes had watched the footage in the car on the way over. She had seen the shove, the fall, the laughter, the phones raised like trophies. She had also seen the moment no one moved. That part, she told a colleague later, was the part that required a federal response. A crime committed in public before witnesses who do not intervene carries a particular weight in civil rights law, and Rebecca Hayes had built her career on understanding exactly how heavy that weight could be. She introduced herself to Emma with the careful gentleness of someone who knew that official presence after trauma can feel like another form of invasion. She crouched slightly to meet Emma's level, keeping her voice low and even. "You're not in any trouble," she said first, because that was always what needed to be said first. "I need you to know that what happened here this morning is being taken seriously." Emma looked at her steadily, still processing. Then Hayes said the words that changed the texture of the entire morning. She had known Emma's father. The statement landed quietly but with tremendous weight. Emma felt something shift in her chest. A door she had not known was closed, swinging open on a hinge she had forgotten existed. Agent Hayes explained carefully, keeping her words measured and her eyes steady. Years ago, in a federal courtroom, a man named David Carter had taken the stand in a civil rights case that most people in that building expected to collapse. He had testified without notes, without rehearsal, with nothing but the plain and unshakable conviction that fairness was not a courtesy but a right. Hayes had been a junior investigator in that case. She remembered every word he said. She remembered the way the room had gone quiet when he spoke, the kind of quiet that comes when truth fills a space completely and leaves no room for anything else. She had told him afterward, outside the courthouse steps, that if his family ever needed someone to stand beside them, she would be there. David Carter had smiled and said he hoped it would never come to that. It had come to that. Emma stared at Rebecca Hayes in the thin autumn sunlight and understood, with a certainty that ran deeper than thought, that this moment was not random. It was a promise kept across years in grief, arriving exactly when it was needed. On October 22, 2024, Cedar Grove Park looked exactly the way Emma needed it to look. The old oak trees had lost half their leaves, and the afternoon light came through the remaining ones in long, golden bars that striped the grass in warmth. The adaptive softball field sat at the south end of the park, freshly chalked. The bases set a little closer together than a standard diamond, adjusted for the particular rhythms of the kids who played here. Emma stood at the edge of the field with a clipboard she never actually consulted, because coaching was not about charts. It was about watching, listening, and knowing when to say something and when to simply stay quiet. Marcus arrived last, the way he usually did, his cleats still half unlaced, his helmet tucked under one arm. He was 11 years old and possessed the kind of effortless cheerfulness that seemed to generate its own weather system. He trotted toward the group and took his place without ceremony, dropping his equipment bag in the grass with a crash that startled the nearest players and made several of them laugh. Emma watched him and felt something in her chest settle, the particular relief of being somewhere you were needed not out of obligation, but out of genuine want. These kids did not know about Jefferson Street. They knew her as Coach Emma, the one who made them run the bases twice if they argued with each other, and who also sometimes brought orange slices. That was enough. That was more than enough. Then November arrived, and with it the letter. It came on a gray Tuesday morning to the house on Maplewood Drive, addressed in official type on stiff county paper. Emma sat at the kitchen table and opened it with both hands, as if its weight required more than one point of support. The charges had been filed. A court date had been set for January 12. The letter used precise, measured language that told her almost nothing about what the day would actually feel like. She set it flat on the table and stared at it for a long time without moving. That night the dream came, the way it always came when something large was pressing against the edges of her waking life. She was in hospital room 402 again, and the machines were doing what machines do in those rooms, counting and reporting with mechanical patience. Her father's face was turned toward her on the pillow, and his voice, though weak, carried the same quality it always had, the quality of something that could not be pushed over. "Stand back up in daylight," he had said. Not stand up, stand back up. The distinction had always mattered to her because standing up suggested you had a choice. Standing back up meant you already knew the weight of the ground, and you were choosing to leave it anyway. She woke with the words sitting in her chest like stones she had decided to carry instead of set down. What she did not expect was what the investigation envelope contained alongside the formal charges. Agent Hayes had included a photocopy. Paper, clipped to the back page, edges slightly worn as if it had been handled many times over many years. It was a transcript. Her father's courtroom testimony, the words he had spoken in that federal case years ago, the words Rebecca Hayes had remembered on courthouse steps. Emma read them slowly, line by line, at the kitchen table in the early morning quiet, and understood that the law that would protect her in courtroom 9 on January 12 was the same argument her father had made with his voice and his conviction long before she ever needed it. He had built her a shelter without knowing exactly when she would need to stand inside it. Emma was outside Denver County Courthouse at 8:40, 5, 20 minutes before the session was scheduled to begin. Ranger sat beside her on the broad stone steps, close enough that his shoulder pressed warm against her leg, his breath making small, steady clouds in the cold air. Behind her, several members of the adaptive softball team had arrived in a quiet group, their presence neither announced nor required but offered, the way genuine support always is. She had not asked them to come. That made it mean more. Courtroom 9 was smaller than Emma had imagined during all the times she had imagined it. The wood paneling carried the particular dim polish of rooms that have witnessed decades of human consequence, and the morning light came through the high windows at an angle that fell across the judge's bench in a pale stripe. The room was not full, but it was not empty either. Emma took her seat and kept her eyes forward, her hands folded in her lap with a stillness that had cost her considerable effort to achieve. Ranger settled at her feet and did not move. Tyler entered with his parents and a defense attorney whose briefcase looked slightly too large for his frame. Tyler was 16 years old and looked, in that moment, considerably younger. His eyes moved to Emma once and then moved away in a manner that was not dismissal but something closer to its opposite, a flinching that comes from looking at the consequence of your own action and recognizing it fully. He sat down without speaking. The judge called the session to order at 9 sharp. When the formal portion of the proceedings reached the question of Tyler's involvement, he confessed. The admission came in a flat, deliberate voice, without the emotional texture that makes confessions feel like relief rather than transaction. But then his attorney added something that shifted the room's understanding. Tyler had not acted alone in spirit. An older brother, 17, 2 years of cruelty practiced and modeled and handed down like an inheritance Tyler had never thought to refuse. He had not known how to refuse it. That did not excuse what happened on Jefferson Street. It explained something, and explanation is not the same as excuse, but it is the beginning of the space where change becomes possible. The judge looked to Emma. In cases involving minors and civil rights violations of this nature, victim input carried formal weight. Emma stood. She had written nothing down, because she had decided the night before that written words would make it too easy to recite rather than mean. She looked at the room and spoke clearly. She said she did not want Tyler imprisoned. She said she did not want his future destroyed in the name of repairing hers. She said what had happened on Jefferson Street was not only about a shove. It was about the 30 students who had watched and chosen silence, and no courtroom sentence would address that silence. She requested restorative justice, a structured process, community service, accountability that required presence rather than punishment. The room was very quiet when she finished. Then it began, softly and without coordination, a sound rising from the back of the courtroom. Several of the students who had stood on Jefferson Street that September morning, who had held their phones and their silence in equal measure, were clapping, not loudly, not dramatically, but with their hands, which had once remained still when they should have moved, now moving in the only act of amends available to them in that moment. The silence on Jefferson Street had not simply faded. It had followed those students into this room, and now, finally, they were answering it. At 9:47 a.m., with the courtroom still carrying the residue of Emma's words, Tyler's mother stood. She did not ask permission. She did not wait for the judge to acknowledge her. She simply rose from her seat, in the second row, with the careful deliberateness of someone who has been building toward a single action for weeks, and has finally arrived at the moment where the action is the only thing left. Her name was Linda Marsh, and she was a woman in her mid-40s with the particular appearance of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had recently decided to set it down regardless of what setting it down might cost her. She looked at Emma and spoke without deflection. She said that what her son had done was not a mistake in the casual sense. That word is often deployed, a lapse, a moment of poor judgment, an aberration from an otherwise steady course. She said it was a pattern she had recognized and not addressed with sufficient urgency, and that recognition and the failure that preceded it belonged to her as much as it belonged to Tyler. She apologized, not as a legal strategy, not in the careful, hedged language that attorneys construct to acknowledge wrongdoing without incurring liability. She apologized as a mother who had watched her child carry behaviors that she had seen modeled in her own home and had told herself, repeatedly, that he would grow out of them. He had not grown out of them. He had grown into them. The room absorbed this in silence. Emma held very still. There is a particular quality to a genuine apology that the body recognizes even when the mind is still deciding how to receive it. It does not resolve pain. It does not undo the scrape of pavement or the sound of laughter or the weight of 30 students' worth of silence. But it acknowledges, with full presence, that the pain is real and that the person before you sees it. That acknowledgement, Emma would later say, was the first thing that had felt like ground beneath her feet since September 18. At 11:32, the judge delivered the sentencing terms: 300 hours of community service, to be completed at Cedar Grove Park in coordination with the adaptive softball program Emma coached. The assignment was not incidental. The judge noted that the most productive form of restorative accountability places the individual in direct, sustained contact with the community they harmed, not as punishment but as education, the kind that requires showing up repeatedly and learning over time what the consequences of casual cruelty look like when they are given faces and names and particular ways of laughing. Tyler would serve his hours alongside the kids on that field. He would see Marcus and the others not as abstract figures in a legal brief, but as actual people who would, over time, teach him something no courtroom ruling ever could. At 12:10, on the broad stone steps of Denver County Courthouse, Tyler faced the small group that had gathered outside. His attorney stood slightly behind him, and his parents flanked him with the particular posture of people who are choosing presence over self-protection. Tyler read from a short statement, his voice uneven but audible. He apologized to Emma, to the students he had humiliated alongside her, to the witnesses who had said nothing and who now, by their presence on these steps, were attempting to say something. He folded the paper when he finished and stood without moving, as if waiting for the weight of what he had said to tell him what to do next. Then Marcus stepped forward. He was 11 years old, still wearing his adaptive softball team jacket, the collar slightly crooked, and he extended his hand, not to Emma, to Tyler. The gesture traveled through the group like a current, visible and quiet and almost unbearably human. Tyler looked at the hand for a moment, then shook it. Emma watched from the edge of the steps and felt something shift in her understanding of what courage actually looked like in practice. She had always associated it with the person who speaks up, who stands against, who holds ground under pressure. She had not fully considered that it also lives in the child who extends a hand first, without being asked, before the other person has earned it. Leadership, she thought, is not the absence of anger. It is the decision to act from a place larger than anger, even when anger would be entirely justified. Marcus had just demonstrated that for everyone on those courthouse steps, including Tyler, including herself. Court orders can force attendance, but they cannot force transformation. That distinction sat in the back of Emma's mind on February 8, 2025, the morning Tyler Marsh arrived at Cedar Grove Park for the first day of his community service hours. She had arrived 30 minutes early, the way she always did, to set up the equipment and let the field settle into its familiar rhythms before the kids got there. The morning was cold enough that her breath came in small white clouds, and the grass carried a thin frost that crunched softly underfoot. She arranged the bases with the particular care she gave to small tasks when larger uncertainties were pressing at the edges of her thoughts. Tyler was coming. She did not know what version of him would show up. He arrived at 9 exactly, alone, without his parents, which she had not expected and which told her something. He wore a plain jacket and carried no phone visibly, and he walked toward the field with the specific kind of quietness that belongs to people who do not yet know where they are allowed to stand. Emma greeted him with a clipboard and a direct look, and told him that his job today was simple: follow the drill and take direction from whoever was running it, which on Saturdays was Marcus. Tyler said nothing in response. He nodded once and looked at the field. The morning ran the way mornings at Cedar Grove usually ran, with the particular mix of earnestness and chaos that makes coaching adaptive sports feel less like a job and more like a form of active faith. The kids arrived in ones and twos, some with parents, some on bikes, all of them carrying the low-level excitement that accumulates across a week of school and releases itself onto the grass without ceremony. Tyler worked the perimeter drills with a focused silence that the younger kids seemed to interpret as intimidation at first, keeping a slight distance from him in the way children navigate unfamiliar variables. Then Marcus fell. It happened at the corner of second base. A patch of frost the morning sun had not yet reached, and the slip was fast and complete, Marcus's feet going out from under him before he could adjust. He hit the ground with a thud that carried across the quiet park, and the nearest kids went still in that reflexive way that children pause before deciding whether something is funny or serious. Tyler was 6 feet away. He moved immediately, covering the distance in 2 steps, and extended his hand before Marcus had finished processing what had happened. He pulled him upright with the casual efficiency of someone who had made this decision without thinking about it, which was the only way it could have been genuine. Marcus dusted the frost off his jacket and grinned. "Slippery," he said. Tyler almost smiled. "Yeah," he said. "You almost had it." The kids resumed their drills. Emma watched this from the sideline and did not allow herself to read too much into a single gesture. A person could be decent in an isolated moment and still be unchanged in the patterns that matter. She had learned this about people, and she did not want to be naive with the same lesson twice. She kept her face steady and her clipboard in her hands, and watched the rest of the morning with the measured patience she had developed coaching kids who deserved patience more than most people offered it. After the session, when the equipment was packed and most of the kids had gone, Tyler lingered near the equipment bag. Emma was tying a closure strap when he spoke without preamble, without apparent strategy in the flat, undecorated voice of someone working through something they had not fully resolved. "When you fell," he said, meaning Jefferson Street, meaning September 18, meaning the specific second she had hit the asphalt. He stopped for a moment and started again. "I was one of the ones who laughed." Emma kept her hands on the strap and did not look up immediately. She let the admission sit in the cold air without rushing toward it or away from it. Then she looked at him. His face carried something she recognized, not the rehearsed remorse of the courtroom, but the particular discomfort of shame that has not yet learned how to resolve itself. She did not tell him it was fine, because it was not fine, and simplifying it into fineness would have been a disservice to both of them. She said instead, "I know," and then she picked up the equipment bag. The morning was over. Something else, she thought, might be beginning. On March 3, 2025, Emma received an invitation from the Colorado Department of Education to speak at the State Youth Inclusion Summit, scheduled for April 18 in Denver. The letter was formal and generous in its language, describing her as a voice for disability inclusion and civil courage in public education. She read it at the kitchen table on Maplewood Drive, the same table where she had read the charge filing 3 months earlier, and she set it down with the same careful deliberateness. Her first instinct was not excitement. Her first instinct was a contraction in her chest that she had learned, over the years, to identify as the specific fear of being seen in the place where you were once made small. Public speaking had always required a particular form of preparation for Emma, not the kind that lives in notes or rehearsed phrases, but the kind that involves persuading the part of yourself that learned to be cautious to agree to be visible. She had spoken in small rooms before, to parent groups at Cedar Grove, to a youth sports board, to the kids on her team when something needed to be said plainly. But a convention center, a stage, a microphone, and an auditorium of strangers, that was a different geography. The brain does not process scale neutrally. It applies old fears to new spaces, which is efficient but not always accurate. She did not respond to the invitation immediately. She folded it and placed it in the kitchen drawer and told herself she would decide in a week. 3 days later she found herself standing in the spare bedroom doorway, looking at the small box on the closet shelf she had not opened in over a year. Her father's things. Not many of them. Not the furniture or the books or the larger objects that get distributed and absorbed into other people's lives after a loss. Just the small things that a person carries in pockets and places on nightstands, the things that are too personal to give away but too heavy to display. She lifted the box down and opened it on the bed. The watch was near the top, a plain analog face with a worn leather strap, the kind of watch that tells time and nothing else. She picked it up and turned it over and looked at the face and felt the air leave the room. The hands had stopped. They were fixed at 11:42, the precise position they had reached at some point during the final days in hospital room 402, when no one had been paying attention to small mechanical details. 11:42. The same numbers that lived on the clock above Jefferson Street on September 18. The coincidence was not something she tried to assign meaning to immediately, because meaning assigned too quickly becomes superstition. But she held the watch for a long time, feeling the weight of its stopped hands, and she allowed the feeling to move through her without trying to manage it. She thought about what it meant to move past a moment that had been recorded in your body. The brain catalogs trauma not in words but in sensations, specific qualities of light, the temperature of air, the particular sound of laughter when it is directed at you rather than with you. Those recordings do not erase. They can be joined by other recordings that alter the context, give the original moment new neighbors, change its meaning within a larger story, but the original remains. Emma understood this not from anything she had been told, but from the way her pulse had behaved every morning she looked at her palms and saw the faint remaining marks the pavement had left. She wound the watch. It did not start. The mechanism had stilled permanently, the way mechanisms do when they have been ignored past the point of recovery. She looked at its frozen face for a long moment in the quiet of the spare room, and then she made a decision that she recognized, as she made it, as the specific kind of decision that determines which direction the rest of a story travels. She put the watch on her wrist. Stopped hands and all, she wore what had happened. She would walk into the convention center on April 18 with the fall and her father and the frozen time all sitting against her pulse. Because they were all part of the thing she needed to say. She closed the bedroom door and walked down the hallway and sat at the kitchen table and wrote one word in the notepad she kept there. Yes. Then she wrote the invitation number below it and picked up the phone. The most dangerous part of cruelty is not the shove. It is the watching. The act of violence requires one person. The culture of violence requires many, all of them choosing the particular safety of stillness, the social calculation that moves faster than conscience and arrives at the same answer every time. Not my problem, not my moment, not my risk. Emma understood this in a way that was not theoretical. She had lived on the floor of it, felt it in the specific quality of the silence that followed her fall, 30 students' worth of human presence choosing invisibility in full autumn light. That silence was what she had come to the Denver Convention Center on April 18, 2025 to address. The auditorium held several hundred people, educators and students and administrators from school districts across Colorado, all arranged in the particular formation of people who have agreed in advance to listen. Emma stood backstage for 4 minutes before she was introduced, her hand resting against the side of her jacket over the watch, feeling its stopped hands through the fabric. Ranger sat beside her, calm and steady in the way he was always calm and steady, his shoulder warm against her leg. The backstage lights were dim, and the sound from the auditorium came through the curtain in a low murmur. The particular sound of a crowd waiting to be moved or informed or challenged, not yet certain which they were about to receive. She walked to the podium and the room settled. She adjusted the microphone and looked out at the assembled faces and let the silence land fully before she spoke. She did not begin with statistics. Statistics are important, and she would use them, but they were not the first thing the room needed from her. The first thing the room needed was the specific weight of a real moment, a real street, a real sky, a real fall. I was pushed in daylight, she said, and the phrase was simple, and she had chosen it precisely because of its simplicity, because the most important truths do not require decoration. She told the story of Jefferson Street. She told it plainly, without melodrama, in the steady, even voice of someone who has found that truth carries its own amplitude when you stop trying to amplify it artificially. She spoke about the shove and the pavement and the laughter. She spoke about the phones and the 30 students and the particular quality of the choice each of them had made, not a grand, deliberate decision but a small, reflexive one the kind made in a second and lived with for much longer. She spoke about silence as a form of participation, about how the culture that allows cruelty to function in schools is not built by the person who acts, but by the accumulated choices of everyone who watches and determines that watching is neutral. It is not neutral. She had learned this on asphalt, and she was saying it now in an auditorium, and she needed everyone in the room to understand that those two locations were connected by the same human mechanism. Halfway through her speech, a student in the 7th row stood up, not to leave. He stood because something in him was requiring it, some internal pressure that had been building through her words and had reached a point where stillness was no longer structurally possible. He was perhaps 17, wearing a school jacket Emma did not recognize, and his voice when he spoke was slightly uneven in the way voices get when a person is saying something they have not planned to say out loud until the moment of saying it. "I was there," he said. "Jefferson Street. I was one of the ones who watched." He paused. The room was absolutely silent. "I didn't help," he said. "I've been thinking about that every day since." He sat down. The room did not immediately return to its previous texture. Something had changed in it, some atmospheric quality, as if the act of one public admission had slightly altered the pressure in the space and made the air easier to breathe. Emma continued. She looked at the student in the 7th row and continued. Because the speech was not finished, and because the most important thing she could do in that moment was not to stop for the confession, but to let the confession become part of the larger argument she was making. When she reached her closing, she looked at the room for a long, quiet moment. Then the applause began, and it was not the sympathetic applause that surfaces when people feel sorry for someone. It was the different, harder sound of people who have just been told something true that they did not previously know how to say, and who are clapping for the truth itself, and for the person who carried it all the way to the podium. May 14, 2025 arrived the way perfect days arrive in Colorado, without announcing themselves, without the fanfare of anticipation, simply there when you opened the door, the light already warm and the air already carrying the particular fresh quality of late spring before summer has had the chance to thicken it. Cedar Grove Park lay open under a wide blue sky, the old oak trees in full leaf now, their shadows moving slowly across the grass in the gentle morning wind. The adaptive softball field had been repainted since autumn, the baselines crisp and white against the green, the equipment cart sitting exactly where it always sat, at the corner of the dugout where Marcus had once left it, and where it had remained because no one saw any reason to move it to a less convenient location. Emma arrived to find the field already busy. Several of the parents had come early and were setting up the small folding chairs along the third baseline the way they did on game days. Marcus was running warm-up laps with 2 other players, his cleats making the small rhythmic sound that Emma had come to associate with the specific contentment of this place. She stood at the edge of the grass for a moment and let herself feel the fullness of the morning, without immediately moving to organize or direct it. This was something she had practiced since the winter, the capacity to be somewhere completely, to receive a moment without already planning the next one. Tyler was at the first base coaching box, demonstrating a technique to one of the younger kids with the patient repetitive quality that had become, over the months of his community service hours, entirely genuine. He had long since fulfilled the 300 hours the judge had assigned. He continued to come. That continuation had surprised Emma less than she had expected it to, because she had watched the transformation move through him slowly and with the particular credibility of things that are not performed but grown, the way a plant does not announce its progress but simply becomes taller. In the 3rd inning of the practice game, Marcus stepped to the plate with 2 players on base, the score tied, and the particular unhurried confidence that characterized everything he did. He worked the count full, fouled off 2 pitches that were almost exactly what he was looking for, and then drove the next one into the gap in left center, both runners scoring, Marcus rounding first and pulling in at second with a grin wide enough to be visible from the coach's box. The small crowd of parents applauded with the disproportionate enthusiasm that small crowds summon when the moment genuinely earns it. Emma applauded too, and the sound of her own clapping surprised her slightly, because it came from a place in her chest that had been less accessible in the months before this one. Later, sitting on the bench after the game had ended and the equipment was being packed, Emma allowed her thoughts to travel to the hospital room, the way they sometimes did without invitation, arriving with the particular quality of memories that are not intrusive but present, part of the ongoing conversation between who you are and who you were shaped by. The machines. The steady mechanical counting. Her father's face turned toward her on the pillow. Unstoppable. He had said it with his eyes open and his voice clear on one of the last days when both of those things were true simultaneously, and she had held the word carefully since, understanding that it was not a description of what she was but a direction for what she was to become. Agent Rebecca Hayes arrived at the park at 2:15, wearing the dark coat Emma recognized from Jefferson Street, moving through the grass with the same composed efficiency. She sat beside Emma on the bench and produced a sealed envelope from her coat pocket and held it out without preamble. Emma took it and opened it slowly. Inside was a single official document on Colorado Department of Education letterhead. Lincoln Ridge High School had formally adopted a permanent inclusion and anti-bullying reform program. The program would be named for David Carter, whose civil rights testimony years before had provided the legal architecture that made the current federal protections applicable to Emma's case. His name, in small dignified print at the top of the policy document, was now attached to a protection that would extend to every student who walked through those school doors. The legacy was not a monument. It was a mechanism. It was something that worked. Emma held the paper carefully in both hands and looked at the field, where Marcus was still celebrating his winning run by attempting to teach a dance step to Tyler, who was executing it with good-natured inadequacy, and she felt something complete itself in her chest, the particular closing of a circle that has been open long enough to have forgotten its own shape. September 18, 2025, exactly 1 year, same street, same autumn light, same angle of sun at the same address on Jefferson Street. But the street itself was different in every way that mattered. The pavement in front of Lincoln Ridge High School was brighter in one stretch, fresh concrete laid for a newly installed accessibility ramp that curved from the sidewalk to the school's main entrance with the clean, purposeful geometry of something built to last. Along the school's eastern wall, a mural covered the full expanse of the brick surface, a wide, vivid composition designed by students in the school's art program, the imagery carrying themes of standing together, of visibility, of the specific brightness that ordinary people carry when they are seen fully and treated accordingly. The mural had taken 6 weeks and 3 rounds of design approval, and it would stay there. The Inclusion Day rally had been organized by the school's new Student Inclusion Council, formed in October of the previous year as one of the conditions of the reform program bearing David Carter's name. Students carried handmade signs and wore coordinating yellow armbands, not because they had been told to, but because the organizing committee had proposed it, and the idea had propagated through the student body with the organic speed of things that catch, because they actually mean something to the people carrying them. The street in front of the school had been temporarily cordoned for the gathering, and by 11 a.m. it was full of students, parents, teachers, and community members, more people than the event organizers had anticipated, which is the specific, gratifying arithmetic of things that resonate more broadly than their planners expected. Tyler Marsh was near the front of the gathering, not on the stage, not at the microphone, but working the edge of the crowd with a stack of inclusion awareness flyers he distributed with the quiet efficiency of someone performing a task, because it needed to be done rather than because it would be noticed. Several students took the flyers without recognizing him. Several recognized him and took them anyway, which was its own form of progress. His mother stood nearby, watching him with the particular expression of a parent who has arrived, after considerable difficulty, at something she had not been certain she would reach. Emma stood at the podium set up on the temporary stage at 11:35. Ranger was beside her as he always was. She looked out at the crowd assembled on Jefferson Street and felt the weight of the year press against her in a single, complex sensation that was not entirely grief and not entirely pride, but something that contained both and exceeded them. She had stood on this street 11 months before in the autumn light with her palms against the pavement and the sound of laughter in her ears. She was standing on it now with a microphone and a ramp and a mural and several hundred people who had come to say that the culture which permitted what happened in September 2024 was being actively replaced by something different. She spoke at 11:40, and at 11:42 she stopped. She stopped deliberately, looking at the watch on her wrist, its hands still frozen at the same position they had been frozen in since she found it in the spare bedroom on Maplewood Drive. She held her wrist up slightly, not dramatically, simply as a point of reference, and she said, "This is the time I fell. I decided not to fix the watch." She paused for one breath, because some things that stop should stay stopped. The crowd was quiet. "This street stops today," she said, meaning the version of this street that had permitted cruelty in daylight, that had equipped bystanders with the social permission to keep their hands in their pockets. And something else starts. She lowered the microphone and stepped back from the podium. Then, from somewhere in the middle of the crowd, one person stood. A student she did not know, from a school she did not recognize, who had come because someone had shared a post about the rally and it had seemed like a place worth standing in. Then another person stood, then 10, then 30, then the entire crowd, rising from their folding chairs and their places on the pavement in the autumn light, standing not out of pity, not out of performance, but out of the particular, difficult, quietly earned human impulse toward respect. Emma felt the warmth of it move through the cold September air toward her, and she looked up at the clear sky above Jefferson Street and spoke too softly for the microphone to catch. "Dad," she whispered. "They're standing up now." The crowd continued to stand, and the sun continued to shine on the same street where something had once tried to diminish her, and on this day the light fell differently, because the people standing in it had finally, collectively, decided to deserve it.